Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And I'm Kemper Donovan.
And this week we are doing a double short story episode. Woo! And I know, much like our recent double Vera Roscoff short story episode, this has a theme, and the theme this time is opera.
Indeed, this is an opera-themed episode. We are covering two short stories here. The first will be The Face of Helen, which is a Mysterious Mr. Quin story, and the second is entitled Swan Song, which is our final installment from the Listerdale Mystery Collection. I suppose we should start off with The Face of Helen. Catherine Brobeck, can you tell us a little bit about the publication history of this one?
Sure. It was published first in the UK in the Storyteller magazine, as a bunch of these were, in April 1927, under the title The Magic of Mr. Quin No. 5, which is not a particularly compelling title. And then in the US in August of that same year in Detective Story magazine, and then of course it was also published in the Mysterious Mr. Quin collection in 1930.
All right, well, let's discuss our victim in this case, who is Gillian West. We have decided to pronounce her name Gillian. Catherine and I were doing a little inventory of those with the name spelled Gillian we know of or know in our lives, and the vast majority of them go by Gillian, not Gillian. Although we do acknowledge that it is very possible that
her name is supposed to be Gillian.
Yeah, that her name is supposed to be Gillian. But we are going to call her Gillian throughout. And this Gillian is said to have a face like Helen of Troy, hence the title.
Right.
So she's pretty.
So she is pretty. And normally when we talk about the victim, we say what happens to them, but we kind of can't right now, so we'll leave that for the time being. And as far as the suspects, well, I mean, again, we don't really know what the crime is, so it's a little bit difficult, but we'll just say it's both of Gillian's suitors. The first, we have Philip Eastney, who is a romantic-seeming young man who has a certain dark quality to him, dark eyes and sort of tousled hair, and dangerous, possibly.
Since we have two suitors dueling for our heroine / victim here, if we were going to gender flip this situation, he would definitely be the Veronica.
Do you guys go to Riverdale?
We do.
Yeah, we're
both
sophomores.
of us together.
Me too. I'm filled with dread.
Why is that?
Are you familiar with the works of Truman Capote? I'm breakfast at Tiffany's, but this place is strictly in cold blood. Veronica Lodge.
Archie Andrews. This is Betty Cooper.
Right.
And then Charlie Burns, who was our next suitor and also suspect, would definitely be the Betty.
A total Betty.
He's a total Betty. And he is a young clerk who is nice enough looking, but, you know, a little blah. Again, a total Betty.
So, the world as it appears to be. Mr. Satterthwaite is at the opera alone. Right. He was bailed on by one of his many countess friends. He has so many. This one because in addition to being a glamorous countess, she's also a very good mother. And her children have the mumps. And it turns out that her husband, he hates music apparently. So he totally just bails the second that his wife decides to stay at home.
Oh yeah, he takes that opportunity to bail and he runs with it hard.
Yeah, that guy does not like going to the opera, or he does not like Mr. Satterthwaite, or both.
Yeah. So Mr. Satterthwaite is kind of wandering the halls of the opera a bit, feeling bad for himself between shows. And the first show on the bill here for this evening of opera is Cavalleria Rusticana. And he is not a huge fan of this show, so he's biding his time before the beginning of the second half of the program, which is an entirely separate opera, Pagliacci. And this is a very common pairing in opera. It's known as the cav-pag double bill. Happens in opera houses all over the world. The pairing began with a presentation at the Met in New York City in 1893, although the order, interestingly, was flipped in that first presentation. It was Pagliacci and then Cavalleria Rusticana, because it really is always cav and then pag now. One of the reasons why they're so often performed together is that they're both really short. They're both one-act operas. Each of them comes in around 75 minutes, meaning that they're very easily performed one and then an intermission, and then the second one making up a more standard length of a single opera, which tends to obviously have multiple acts and take more like 3 to 4 hours, if not longer. I actually once attended the Wagner Ring Cycle.
I remember that you did.
In LA, and the shortest of those operas was 3.5 hours of those 4 operas. So it was a good 16 plus. So 2 75-minute operas smashed together with an intermission makes for a near 3-hour experience, putting us into regular opera land, hence our cav-pag pairing. But there's also another reason for these two operas going so well together. What would that be, Catherine?
They have very similar plots. Namely, both operas concern a love triangle. It's amongst a peasant class in Cavalleria Rusticana, and it's amongst a theater troupe in Pagliacci. And in both cases, this love triangle ultimately turns violent when one of the lovers is spurned.
So, opera history aside, before the performance starts, Mr. Satterthwaite runs into someone at the opera in the hallway as he is just wandering up and down.
I wonder who.
Who could it be? Who could it be? I just can't imagine who. Could it be?
Mr. Quin?
It might just very well be Mr. Quin. So Mr. Quin has a seat by himself in the stalls, and so Satterthwaite very swiftly invites him up to his box for company. Mr. Quin also was not really there for Cavalleria Rusticana because, as he says to Satterthwaite, he, has a sort of obvious interest in Pagliacci, which is one of the more on-the-nose things to ever be said in a Mr. Quin short story, possibly. Harley Quinn might have a particular interest in both Italian drama and clowns.
Well, especially because in Pagliacci, they're putting on a show, right? Like there's a show within a show element.
In a show, yeah.
And the characters in that show are, wait for it, Columbine and Harlequin, because they're putting on a commedia dell'arte. I mean, They're literally playing Harlequin and Columbine and the assorted commedia dell'arte characters. So, yes, I actually commend Christie for her restraint in not completely spelling that out.
Well, I mean, it is relying on an assumption that I suppose, what the plot of Pagliacci is.
That you've seen Pagliacci before. I suppose it is made clear that Pagliacci features a lot of clowns. The image I think most people would have of clowns involves a Harlequin-like costuming.
What you're saying, Kemper, that most people do not have as their image of clowns Pennywise?
Oh, come on, bucko. Don't you want a balloon?
Well, and Pagliacci itself, the word means clowns. So yeah, of course, Harley Quinn is a big old Pagliacci fan.
Right, and so they're up in the box and surveying the audience, and Satterthwaite spies a head of golden hair below them that fits the head so perfectly that he's never seen better hair, at least from up above. And he and Mr. Quin have a long conversation about whether or not her face may so match her hair. And then when she eventually turns, it's an equally beautiful face. It's a Cleopatra, a Mary Stuart, a Helen of Troy.
Oh boy. There's a whole lot of male gaze going on.
A lot of male gaze.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. The opera itself is pretty good. And its new tenor, Joachim, who...
Say that 3 times fast, Kemper.
Yeah. Apparently, he's touted as the new Caruso. There's a lot of name checking, actually, of Enrique Caruso, who is still, even to this day, one of the best known tenors in opera history, even though his heyday was the early 20th century. I mean, he sang from 1895 till 1920. He's actually one of the first worldwide celebrities. And the fact that he reached such acclaim before film, before really the popular, at least, advent of film is pretty striking.
Well, and also before high-quality recording.
Yeah, I mean, he did. Recordings were responsible for a lot of his
Correct, they were
acclaim.
Available. Right.
They were available, and phonographs. There were phonograph recordings of him that were very popular, and people would even gather to listen to recordings of him. But you had to be very talented to reach worldwide celebrity. So this new tenor has a voice that's incredibly powerful and vibrant, and he can sing both the native peasant songs of his vaguely Eastern European homeland, it's not ever really specified, and the sobs and quivers that are required of him in this very tragic opera.
After the opera, Satterthwaite and Mr. Quin see this lovely creature on a settee in the hall with her opera date, who is this dark, tempestuous-seeming young man who looks uncomfortable in his suit. And the girl herself is just as beautiful as she looked from up above, but her clothes are a little cheap, her white shoes are a little mussed. And essentially, they are not of Mr. Satterthwaite's class at all. They're maybe of the artiste class. And another blonder, better-dressed gentleman joins them. And the two men basically look askance at one another, and the girl looks upset.
So Mr. Satterthwaite and Mr. Quin go outside to get taken home by Satterthwaite's driver. But Mr. Satterthwaite actually is the only one who ends up going in that car because Mr. Quin prefers to go his own way, probably because he's a ghost and was never there.
Right. Hard to get in the car if you're not corporeal.
Right. He just kind of, dissipates as he does. And he leaves Satterthwaite cryptically telling him that if anything should happen, it is for Satterthwaite to act. Intriguing.
So Satterthwaite rounds the corner to his Rolls, just waiting on the side. And before he gets there, he sees the blonde man and the dark-haired man in a brawl on the street corner, while the girl stands afraid off to the side. And so the police have been summoned, but Satterthwaite grabs this girl, Jillian West, away from the scene and physically forces her into the Rolls, which she gets into mostly because I guess Satterthwaite seems non-threatening and rich. I mean, that's not a super good reason to get into a car with a stranger.
And kind of old and desiccated, I guess, but still.
Yeah, I mean, he basically tells her that she doesn't want to get mixed up with the police who have been summoned, so that's part of the motivation. But in the car, she gives her address in Chelsea, and he drops her off, and she gives him her number. He will figure out what happens with the police and let her know.
So the next Sunday, Satterthwaite is wandering Kew Gardens, reminiscing about a romance in his past. I guess it wasn't Alice the maid, who we learned about in a previous episode. It seems to be one of his class because he was planning to marry the girl, but then she instead decided to confess to him that she was in love with another man in the very moment that he was going to propose to her. And she requested his advice, and she friend-zoned him, is what she did.
Oh, friend-zoned him in the worst possible moment.
Yeah, poor Mr. Satterthwaite. Nevertheless, he still thinks of Kew Gardens as a romantic spot, and it is here where he comes across Jillian and the Betty, the young clerk who is not very exciting and is just fine. This is the suitor named Charlie Burns, and it turns out that he has just proposed to her, and she has accepted, even though, again, he seems rather dull. Mr. Satterthwaite is a little surprised about this. They are both very much afraid how that other man, remember dark tempestuous Veronica, a.k.a. Philip Eastney, is going to react. They're really terrified to tell him.
So later at Jillian's apartment, Satterthwaite checks in on her, and she tells him that actually, Philip reacted much better than expected to her news. He was upset, but, in the end, in fact, he'd even come by and brought her a gift to essentially remember him by. And part of their relationship is that he believes so strongly in her musical talent, which we know from Mr. Satterthwaite is actually not that great. But Philip apparently thought so. And so he gives her, a radio so that she will be reminded of their shared love of music, as well as a beautiful, delicate green glass orb that he made at his job, which I guess is as some sort of artisanal glass worker, because apparently Philip Eastney, lives in Portland and
slash Williamsburg.
Williamsburg, and Philip Eastney, I guess, ultimately decent guy, right?
Seems to be. I mean, I don't know if we mentioned that Gillian West is a singer. I mean, Mr. Satterthwaite was right when he guessed that perhaps they were of the artist class, and she sings for him, and he says she's basically. She's fine.
Yeah.
Her appearance, sadly, I mean, this is such a horrible thing to say, but her appearance is by far the most interesting thing.
Well, and Satterthwaite says that if she has any success at all, it's going to be because people want to look at her.
Right. She'd, I think, have more success trying to be a singer in the 21st century, when I think it's such an unfortunate thing, but the way that singers look is actually so important. It's not enough to have a beautiful voice. You got to look like a supermodel too, I
mean, you got to work that Instagram, Kemper.
You got to work the gram. Got to gram it up. All right, so Mr. Satterthwaite feels pretty good about this. He's like, great, all's well that ends well, And he goes off to, where else? His favorite restaurant, Arlecchino. Where he has sat down with Mr. Quin before in the hopes of running into him once again. But instead, he runs into Philip Eastney, who he bases this on the orb that he saw in Gillian West's apartment. But he does believe that Philip Eastney is a talented and interesting young man. And he's
like a little bit of a man crush on him. He's like, oh, well, he's very glamorous and like dashing in like a dark way. And also like, what a beautiful glass orb.
Yeah, and he then proceeds to have an even greater regard for Philip Eastney because they get down and dirty and have a deep conversation. What do they talk about, Catherine?
Well, they really hit it off. Philip Eastney, it turns out he doesn't think it's super weird that Satterthwaite just sits down with him. In fact, he wanted to talk to somebody. He's glad that Satterthwaite's there. And so he tells him about his work during the war. And he did some kind of work. It's not implied necessarily that he's a scientist, but that he did some work in the manufacture of gases for the war effort. He tells Satterthwaite all about a particularly potent gas that they worked on as a special project, but it never ended up being used. It was so potent, a mere whiff if it could kill. But armistice had come and the gas had been shelved.
Wow, what extraneous information. I wonder if that will turn out to be important.
I wonder. Right, but they move off that topic. And then what else does he talk to Satterthwaite about?
They talk about music. And in particular, Philip Eastney talks about his love of opera and how he heard Caruso when he was young. And he knows that Caruso's voice was so powerful it could shatter glass, literally shatter glass. He waxes nostalgic about that. The dinner ends. Mr. Satterthwaite and Philip Eastney both excuse themselves. Eastney thanks Satterthwaite for listening to him, and they each wander off into the night.
They do. What a lovely dinner at Arlecchino.
So, end of the story, right? Philip Eastney just seems to be a stand-up guy, and Gillian West and her bland young man are going to live happily ever after, right?
Right, absolutely.
Except, of course, something dark and devious is happening in the world as it actually is. Because back out on the street, as Mr. Satterthwaite is wandering off in his wraith-like way, something strikes him. And he can't quite put his finger on what it is, but something is bothering him, and he gets increasingly nervous before he buys a copy of the London radio program from a passing newsboy. Ah, yes, we always have to have a sequence in which a newspaper is read in a Christie short story. Wouldn't be complete without it.
No.
So remember that tenor who was compared to Enrique Caruso earlier in the story, the one who performed Pagliacci. Joachim is his name. Let's never forget it. And he is scheduled to perform on the radio in just a few minutes, including the Salve Demora from Faust, which is part of Caruso's repertoire. as well as this shepherd's song, which is his own specialty. And this seems to be part of his repertoire from his vaguely Eastern European collection of songs.
Mr. Quin saw him before they went to the opera, and in the performance that Mr. Quin had seen, he'd performed this shepherd's song, which is apparently it's a grand thing on its own.
Right, it's a grand thing on its own that involves a sort of piercing, shrieking note that is sung out at intervals as well. That is, we are told about that earlier on in the story. This makes Mr. Satterthwaite think back to that poison gas that Philip Eastney had helped to manufacture for the war, and that pretty orb that he had sent to Gillian West, which seemed to have some sort of a gas perhaps inside of it, which certainly looked very pretty. And then he thinks about how Enrique Caruso's singing voice apparently shattered glass, and Philip Eastney had noted that. And Mr. Satterthwaite has a eureka moment, which sends him running like a crazy person for a cab back to Gillian West's flat, where he throws his way inside through the door. The radio is on because Gillian West is about to listen to this performance by Joachim. So Mr. Satterthwaite grabs Gillian, drags her into the hallway. He is about to shut the door, but not before a poor, unfortunate random cat sneaks in first.
Right. And so Gillian looks at him like he's a crazy person, which also everybody in the street and the cab driver looked at him like, because he has seemed exactly like a crazy person. And so they can hear the radio going on and the performance going on until finally there is a tinkling of glass. And he proceeds to tell her everything. And he goes out onto the street after all this to walk home. And who does he run into?
He runs into Philip Eastney on the street, who seems quite pleased, but then very disconcerted to see Mr. Satterthwaite out there. And Mr. Satterthwaite tells him that he knows everything. He knows what Philip Eastney's plot was, which I'm sure is obvious to most listeners at this point, but just to bring it home, he put the poison gas that he had manufactured for the war inside the orb he sent to Gillian West, then told her to listen to that program / mentioned it to her, and she's a singer, so she was going to listen to it anyway. And he knew that those piercing cries that Joachim would make in the course of Shepherd's Song would shatter the glass, thereby allowing the poison gas to escape and killing Gillian West, because he was not okay with Gillian West choosing.
He was not that cool about being the spurned lover. And as we should have known from those operas that they were watching earlier, a spurned third party is maybe not going to take things so well.
Hell hath no fury like a Veronica scorned.
Right, or in this case, a crazy poison gas manufacturer.
So Satterthwaite tells Eastney all of that, and he also informs him that his plot was foiled because it was just a cat that ended up dying from that poison gas, thereby proving...
poor cat.
A poor cat. I know. A cat was harmed in the making of this story,
yeah.
So Eastney's plot has been proven, but also has not been successful. And Eastney turns to go while Satterthwaite is... It's odd because Satterthwaite doesn't seem concerned by the fact that Eastney is getting away.
No, because there's a policeman right there. And instead, he kind of just shoots the breeze with the policeman to say that he's not like a weird, suspicious person walking around in the middle of the night. Then they hear a splash into the Thames. And the policeman very casually posits that, must be another one of those suicides over a woman. They're both kind of like, yep, better go on our merry way. And it's a very odd way to end, because basically all they do is like glance over the side of the railing.
Yeah, I have to say there's a really snobby through line running in this story, which is that Mr. Satterthwaite is so confused by how anyone could prefer Betty over Veronica. He doesn't understand why Gillian West would want this clerk when she could have the genius that is Philip Eastney. So Mr. Satterthwaite, even though he has foiled this murderer's plot, legitimately feels for the murderer. He feels for the genius who has been turned down in favor of the plain man. And I think it goes to, he was mulling earlier.
His own rejection.
And the fact that, and this is always a subject for rumination in the Mysterious Mr. Quin stories how Mr. Satterthwaite has been passed over in his life, and he's been an observer and not a player. He's hating the game here.
Yes.
And I think in some ways, because he's identifying with Phil Beesney, that's why he is a little more lackadaisical than we would expect him to be in terms of following Philip Beesney and then allowing him to commit suicide, and just more feeling sad about it than anything else.
Right. I mean, you would think also, like, wouldn't you have to have like a hazmat crew into Jillian's apartment?
One would think. I guess it was a little bit of poison, just enough that it would have invaded her apartment to an extent to definitely kill her, but then get dissipated immediately. Let's not inquire.
Dwell on that, I guess, because I would just be like, oh my God, you had to evacuate
like her apartment building at least. Yeah. True. And that is an end to The Face of Helen. And before we get to our second opera-themed short story, I would like to have a little intermission of our own in this podcast. Consider this the interval between Cav followed by Pag, if you will. I would just like to talk about Christie and her own love of music, which was actually quite serious because it's not a coincidence that she chose to write 2 short stories steeped in the world of opera and music. She was a great lover of music. She was an avid pianist and singer herself, and had been so ever since she was a child. She actually invented her own operetta, which was called Marjorie. She wrote it and composed it herself, although she admits in her autobiography that she didn't, quote, compose exactly, but I sang snatches of it experimentally in the garden. And she says, I had some vague idea that I might really be able to write and compose music one day. And she actually composed a song as an adult, setting a poem of hers to music. And she composed a waltz, which was called 1 Hour with Thee. And she's very modest about it in her autobiography. She says it was a trite tune, and she calls the title rather extraordinary. So we don't get the sense that this was the best waltz ever. But, you know, she maintained that love of music throughout her life. She always played the piano, always had pianos in her homes, and just had a great love of playing for herself and listening to music. And I think we can tell with these 2 stories. I think it's really easy because she was such an expert at one very specific thing, i.e. crafting puzzle mysteries, and perhaps more broadly writing fantastic mystery novels, that it's easy to forget what a vibrant, well-rounded, fascinating personality she was as an actual person living in the world, because she really was. And
let us never forget about her travels and her interest in archaeology.
No, I mean, this woman, she was a Renaissance woman. She had so many interests and so many passions. For her teenage years, she really thought quite seriously about being a concert pianist and even potentially a singer. She went to various sorts of educational establishments to finish her education, and most of these places were a total disaster. She recounts them very amusingly in her autobiography, but by far the most successful of them was a Miss Dryden's establishment in Paris, where she was one of 12 young women who were all studying music in some way. There was an emphasis on music at this private school, and she studied piano there with an Austrian man named Charles Förster. And she claims in her autobiography, I practiced with real assiduity, usually about 7 hours a day. So that's serious.
Yeah, it really is.
If she's to be believed. She also had a singing teacher at this time who was a Monsieur Bouet, who eventually let her sing a number of arias, including Vici d'Arte, which we will be getting to in just a moment from the opera Tosca. Not sure if she did it on her stomach. That will make sense in a moment. She honestly really does sound pretty passionate about music in her recounting of those days in her autobiography. And this all kind of came to a climax where she had this recital that was kind of a day of reckoning for her. And again, I'm quoting from her autobiography here because this was an important moment. There was a visiting personage coming, and she had been preparing for it for a long time. And she sat down at the piano, and this was kind of the make or break moment for her. And this is what she writes. As soon as I sat down at the piano, inefficiency overwhelmed me like a tide. I played wrong notes, my tempo went, my phrasing was amateur and ham-handed. I was just a mess. End quote. And she asked her teacher after this disaster if he thought that she had the temperament for performance, and he said no, and she agreed. And she wrote, such a rebuff coming early helped me for the future. It taught me that I had not the kind of temperament for exhibition of any kind. I can describe what it seemed like by saying that I could not control my physical reaction. So she just wasn't a performer. She decided to...
I feel her.
I do too. You know, it's funny. I have played and I still do play a number of musical instruments myself. I am a dedicated amateur, and I know exactly what she means. It's awful when your body betrays you.
Well, I mean, it's also, there are just certain things. I mean, I was a pretty talented flautist when I was young and did practice and did have private lessons. And there is sometimes, though, a point, I think, between amateur and real talent where you realize that sometimes you can play a certain thing, you can play it very, very well, but maybe you can't play outside of that, you know? Or maybe if you freeze, you can't make the adjustment to make something better, you know? Mm-hmm. There's a real skill, not just technically, but in performance that a lot of people just don't have. There's a corollary to that, which is that there are plenty of really good or brilliant performers who might not actually be that technically good.
Absolutely. And some of them have made brilliant careers out of it.
Right. And some of them you might want to listen to every single day.
Yeah.
Much more than you would somebody who is merely technically talented.
That's an excellent segue into our second story, because we will be talking about that dichotomy. What is our second story, Catherine?
It's Swan Song, and it was first published in the Grand Magazine in September 1926, then of course in the Listerdale Mystery Collection in June 1934, and in the Golden Ball and Other Stories in the U.S. in 1971. It's the last story in the Listerdale Mystery Collection.
All right. Well, in terms of our victim, we're going to hold off on this for the most part, but we could say that it is a young Italian man from many years ago and his beloved, and perhaps opera fans for what they are going to miss out on. But that is really vague and unhelpful. So let's just move on from the victim category. We're clearly not in puzzle mystery territory here, and move on also from the suspects, who I suppose we could say is the Camorra. As a whole, we've come across the Camorra before. That would be yet another organized crime group within Italy, similar to the mafia, but not the same as the mafia.
Right.
Yeah, let's just roll right into the world as it appears to be.
Madame Paula Nazorkoff is a world-famous opera singer. She wakes up late in her London hotel room while her manager, Mr. Quin, frets about her schedule and her mood, and he informs her that her schedule for London is packed. 5 shows at Covent Garden, so 3 Toscas, 2 Aidas, 1 at Albert Hall, because everyone does it and it'll be packed, so it'll just be a special concert, and 1 at the private home of the Earl and Lady Rostonbury, who are famous for their private performances that always include royalty, and they will pay her a massive amount of money for it. They've requested Madame Butterfly, but after some pause, Nazorkoff picks up a magazine she has just been reading to seemingly find where she knows that name from, Rostonbury. And after looking at it for a second, she suddenly agrees that she will do this performance at this country house, but only if it is Tosca. After all, Tosca is the role that she is world famous for. So Mr. Cohen goes to make the arrangements and hears her whisper to herself, "At last, at last." after all these years.
It's almost as if we're in an opera ourselves. Rather melodramatic. It should also be noted that we find out Nazorkoff is still very pretty with red hair and a long neck. And she is in her mid-40s at this point. She has, some signs of aging, a couple of crow's feet around the eyes, but she's doing pretty well for herself. And we also learn that she was taught to sing by nuns when she was just a girl. And as a result, she believes that her Visi d'arte from Tosca, which is this famous aria within Tosca, don't worry, we will be getting into the specifics of Tosca, the opera, very soon. She thinks that her version of that aria is the best version, even better than some trash Jurica, who is actually a very real Czech soprano.
Person.
Yeah. Who was
Maria Jurica,
and she was nicknamed the Moravian Thunder. And who lived to the ripe old age of 94 in New Jersey, of all places. Yeah, dying at the end of the 20th century, right?
Early 1980s.
Yeah, and she was famous for singing that aria on her stomach. She actually was able to sing it lying down on the stage because it is an aria that is sung in a moment of great vulnerability.
Try to get breath support on your stomach.
Yeah. Paula Nazorkoff, apparently, she goes on her stomach for no one. But even so, given the fact that she, has this idyllic upbringing with nuns and just has the passions, she's able to inhabit this character of Tosca just to perfection, according to her.
Right. And so they go Chez Rustonbury, where they even have their own private theater. And they've brought down the creme de la creme of conductors and performers, and of course the guests who will come, including the Italian baritone Rascari, who is Nazorkoff's preferred Scarpia in Tosca. She goes on at great length about this earlier, about how he's the only one that she will perform opposite in Tosca. And all has been going swimmingly, including Nazorkoff's behavior to everyone. She's a perfect darling, which worries Mr. Cohen. And rightfully so, because Rascari comes down with food poisoning, and probably from ptomaine. Because, of course.
Ptomaine!
Yeah, could we have a Christie short story without ptomaine poisoning?
Put ptomaine to poisoning. Yay! I actually just realized recently, ptomaine poisoning is food poisoning.
Yeah.
It's just an old-fashioned name for food poisoning.
Well, there are different kinds of food poisoning,
but
right?
Ptomaine, but ptomaine is pretty much just referring to food poisoning. Like when someone says ptomaine poisoning, they just mean food poisoning. It's not like a specific bacterium.
No, but I just always assume that it comes from like canned fish. Because
me too.
So accurate or not, that is like my association with that word.
It has to involve like canned shellfish.
Right. So, that might be erroneous, but that is still my association with it.
Me too. All right. So fearing that the performance will be ruined because they can't get anyone from London fast enough, Lady Rustonbury remembers their neighbor, who is this retired, very famous French baritone, Edouard Bréon. And she motors over to his house and bullies him into coming over. She's not going to take no for an answer. And
she gets her way.
Yeah, he does come over, and he takes on the role of Scarpia to save the production.
So at the house, everyone gathers round, except for Nazorkoff, who's fanning herself regally in a corner, while Bréon tells these fabulous tales of his singing career, and then also the skill that it takes to perform Tosca. And all these stories are to the light, basically, of the Rustonbury's daughter, Blanche. And while he's talking about the skills needed to do Tosca, he talks also about how you can really find talent anywhere at the end of the day. And this is sort of where Nazorkoff steps in a little bit to the conversation. Bréon mentions that the best Tosca he probably ever heard was, she wasn't quite developed enough. It was too young of a singer, but it was in a very small performance outside of Milan. And she was so good that he would have basically done anything saying wink, wink to help her career. But this silly little thing was in love with a ne'er-do-well who had links to the Camorra, and this young singer had begged for Briand's help, but he'd wink, wink, not been able to do anything because he hadn't wanted to. So the young man was executed. And the young singer went to a convent, and the world lost a great singer, and, too bad. Nazorkoff scoffs, basically, that, Russians are rather tougher cookies, more or less. At which point, Mr. Cowan gives her a little bit of a look.
Yeah, we're not exactly sure what that look means, since it's not a crazy inference to make from her name, Paula Nazorkoff, that she is, in fact, Russian. So she's identifying herself as a Russian here, and she's put herself out as a Russian.
Right.
So the show goes on as it does, and it's a success. It's absolutely beautiful. At first, people don't respect the power of Nazorkoff in Act 1 of Tosca, but the trick here is that she's saving her voice and her acting chops for the second and third acts, which is when Tosca really makes a big impact. All right, Catherine, I think it's time to talk about Tosca, the opera itself.
Here's where we're going to do a little deep dive on the plot of Tosca. Probably most people know it was written by Puccini. It was first performed in Rome in 1900, but it was based on this 1887 play, La Tosca, by Sardou, who's a French writer. And it originally starred Sarah Bernhardt, interestingly. But the plot involves Tosca, who is a beautiful young singer, and her lover, Cavaradossi, who is a painter, who is essentially abetting his friend Angelotti, who is an enemy of the state, because they're in the midst of war in Italy. And so his best friend is now a fugitive. He's helping him out, and essentially he's hiding him in his villa. All the while, Tosca herself is being lusted after by this sort of government official, police captain, Scarpia.
It's sounding a little familiar to the story that this singer Briand was telling about that young Italian singer he was interested in. Interesting. Back to Tosca, though. Scarpia, corrupt police captain, government official, he arranges for Cavaradossi to be erroneously arrested and tortured until he gives up his friend, his revolutionary friend. And Tosca, not being able to stand her beloved being tortured this way, gives up the friend's hideout. And that friend then kills himself, so that's a mess. And in the meanwhile, they're going to execute Cavaradossi, like Tosca's love, unless Tosca submits to Scarpia. He says, I will let him go if you have sex with me.
Right.
It's not put that baldly within the...
But it more or less is.
Yeah, it certainly sounds a lot more eloquent in Italian lyrics, but that's what he does. So she tries everything. She doesn't, she despairs. She obviously does not
offers
want to
him
do
money.
This. Yeah, she tries to bring him money, anything else other than this. But she finally agrees when she hears the execution being set up, and when she gets Scarpia to agree to give them paperwork for safe passage once she has submitted herself to him and the fake execution goes off. So she says, fine, I will do this. Write out this paperwork, give it to me now, and then that is what I will use with my beloved Cavaradossi to get out. So he says, okay, here's the paperwork. Stupidly, he gives her the paperwork before sealing the deal, so to speak, with Tosca, but that's what he does. So she has it in her hand, and as he's about to kiss her, she stabs him and says, this is Tosca's kiss.
Right.
And she takes the papers and kind of like arranges his body, out in the room where she's killed him. And there are a couple of stills from operas around the time that this short story was written, which I will include in our social media, that show the scene. And it's described very specifically within the short story, how she puts these candles next to his head and lays the crucifix on him. Yeah, that's very much in the opera. It's this really dark, dramatic scene. And
she also says that, once she makes sure that he's dead, she says that she can forgive him.
Right. Once he's dead, then she does ultimately forgive him. I mean, the interesting thing about Tosca, the opera, is that it is a robust love triangle in problematic ways, since really this man is doing everything he can to
he's trying
rape
to he's trying to rape her.
He's trying to rape her. Yeah. But the relationship between Tosca and Scarpia is just as central to the story as the relationship between Tosca and Cavaradossi. There's a lot going on emotionally between Tosca and Scarpia. So that is how Act 2 of the opera ends, and that is how Act 2 of the opera within our short story ends as well. I mean, Christie very carefully describes all of that.
And quotes Tosca in Italian.
And quotes Tosca in Italian, and the curtain goes down, and I guess we're at the end of our Act 2, and we still have one act to go. Fantastic. Let's watch Act 3, except there never is any Act 3, is there?
No, because Nazorkoff performs Act 2 beautifully, passionately, the best, most realistic performance she's ever given. So when Tosca stabs Scarpia and then lays his body out and the curtain goes down for Act 3, all of these incredibly wealthy and connected people are sitting in the audience raving about how good she is. And then someone calls for a doctor.
Uh-oh.
And then someone else calls for the police.
It's time for the world as it actually is. Nazorkoff really was channeling Tosca there a little bit more literally than her audience realized, because she actually stabbed the singer Brayon.
Right.
And it is Blanche, who is the Rustonbury's daughter, who has an idea of what's going on here, because she was listening very closely to Brayon's story and Nazorkoff's response to that story. She has put two and two together here and figured out that the Italian ingenue Brayon was obsessed with, the so-called Bianca Capelli, whose name is very similar to Blanche's own, Bianca Blanche, basically the same name. That was Paula Nazorkoff.
Right.
And this is why her secretary gave her a side eye when she said, well, we Russians are tougher than that, because he knew that she was not Russian, that she was actually Italian. That was when he also perhaps got an inkling of what may have been going on here, even though it's not like he's an accessory here. He didn't quite understand what was happening. And
the reason, of course, why she had needed to look up the Rustonburys before she agreed to go was because presumably in that glossy country home magazine that she was reading, it mentioned their neighbor. So it was never about the Rustonburys. It was about the fact that they were neighbors with Brayon.
Right. And Christie plays very fair with that clue. I mean, that is one of the few clues in here, because when Lady Rustonbury goes to Edward Brayon's house to get him to perform in the opera, the fact that he is featured in their glossy newspaper piece is mentioned. That's laid in there for sure. And Nazorkoff allows herself to be taken away by the police as she utters the final line of the short story, which just happens to be the final line of an opera we so recently talked about.
La commedia è finita!
That's the last line of Pagliacci.
Thereby tying together these two stories in such a nice little bow for us in this double episode.
And also, right, and I mean, we didn't obviously finish the plot of Tosca, but Tosca eventually, spoiler alert, Tosca kills herself at the end of Tosca.
I know, it's the only thing that's actually a little awkward about the blocking of the story within the story in here, because we don't get to watch the end of Tosca.
We don't know what the end of Tosca is? Yeah, it is a little bit weird, because if you don't know what the plot is, you could finish the story and be like, well, wait, didn't we end at Act 2? This entire thing is supposed to be mirroring the plot of Tosca.
Right.
Well, how does Tosca end?
Right. Let's just say that if Paula Nazorkoff's life continues to parallel that of Tosca, it's not going to end well for her, because, in the third act, Tosca goes to Cavaradossi and says, okay, you just have to submit to this fake execution. She even coaches him on how to fake die, and he submits to the execution, but
Scarpia double-crossed her.
From beyond the grave, Scarpia gets his own back, and he double-crossed her indeed, and poor Cavaradossi actually is executed. And Tosca flings herself from off a wall as the police are closing in on her. And her final line, actually, and this is why, again, it's so interesting. You would think that the final line in Tosca would be some sort of romantic allusion to Cavaradossi, her love, who just died and who she's about to join. but it is actually... O Scarpia, avanti, addio, we meet before God. Again, just lots going on between those two. And quite a dramatic ending to a very dramatic opera. The only other thing I would like to say about Tosca before we close, it's just funny that one of the 20th century's almost universally recognized greatest Toscas was approximately, I believe, 2 years old when this short story was published, and that would be Maria Callas. People have forgotten about Maria Giurizza because when you say Tosca, 9 out of 10, I think, opera fans will, within the first minute, mention Maria Callas. Because it is a role that is very much an acting role. And Maria Callas, similar to Paula Nazorkoff, was a singer who, when she started out in her career, she actually was a bit heavier, kind of more of the traditional body shape, I guess, of an opera singer. Mm-hmm. But she lost a lot of weight mid-career and really had this sort of second phase where she played a lot of these romantic heroine roles. And some people think that when she lost the weight, her voice coarsened and it really ruined her voice. But she was such a superb actor that apparently watching her, it didn't even matter. Which is where, like, we were talking about having the ability to perform and, like, being a born performer. And she apparently was just transfixing in this role in particular because it requires such acting, and she was able to pull it off to such perfection. She didn't lie in her stomach, but she just was so utterly convincing as Tosca that was one of her best roles.
Yeah, I mean, I also recommend, if nobody's ever seen it, if there's a good production somewhere, watching the Terrence McNally play Masterclass. Which is a really excellent straight play. It's not a musical, and it's obviously not an opera. It's just a drama that is about Maria Callas in the 70s and her voice and her feelings about how she looked. And, obviously it's a fictional interpretation of her, but it sort of gets to a lot of those points that you just mentioned.
Do you have a favorite opera, Catherine?
I don't. My interest in opera is theatrical more than it is musical, which sounds like a terrible thing to say. But I mean, I love a grand set and some amazing costuming and, bloody drama.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the core elements of it. And I think people forget that. They just think of people wailing away almost in a vacuum, but the theatricality is just as much of an element as the
so like I can be compelled by watching like a lesser opera if the production's really good. Mm-hmm. Right. Do you have a favorite opera?
I mean, if the first opera I ever saw was La Traviata. If you had to pick an opera that was a basic opera, it's probably La Traviata, which also happens to be the opera that Julia Roberts watches and cries to in Pretty Woman.
Did you enjoy the opera, dear?
Oh, it was so good, I almost peed my pants.
What?
She said she liked it better than Pirates of Penzance.
And it mirrors sort of what's happening in Pretty Woman, but it is also just it's Verdi. It's a beautiful opera in its own right. I think I saw it when I was 8. I went with my dad, and I've seen it many times too, because it's often part of the repertoire at like various places, and it has a lot
of course it is.
It has a lot of arias people know. There's so many different types of opera too. That's the fun thing about it, depending on the language and the time period of when it was composed.
I mean, this is by no means my favorite opera, and please nobody think this because I would be very embarrassed. But given the age that I am, the obvious choice is, of course, La Boheme.
Sure.
Because I was an early middle school kid when Rent came out.
Mm-hmm.
As most people know, Rent is La Boheme. So, if you got really into Rent, you probably want to know what the inspiration for Rent was, and then you wouldn't listen to La Boheme.
Right. And you love that too, because it is a very crowd-pleasing.
It's very crowd-pleasing. I've seen La Boheme like twice.
Yeah.
And, it's almost embarrassing, frankly, depending on the production of it. But it's a very, very much like a melodrama soap opera crowd pleaser, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, similar to Tosca, Puccini did a lot of those, and they were often looked down upon, certainly in his day and even now.
La Boheme, Tosca, Madama Butterfly, and what's the one
Turandot.
that Turandot? Yeah.
Those are the crowd pleasery, easy to follow, easy to listen to, super dramatic to the point of melodrama operas that I think people who are interested in being exclusive when it comes to their opera appreciation are not going to embrace Puccini. But no. I think, of course, there's room to embrace Puccini and others. I think we are at an end to our opera-filled episode of Agatha Christie. Glad that we did that.
Yeah, me too.
We are actually, believe it or not, going to do something perhaps even more special for our next episode, given all the specialness we just had in this one. We are doing an interview. We are at long last interviewing friend of the podcast who we have mentioned so many times, Jamie Bernthal, who is an Agatha Christie scholar. He wrote the book Queering Agatha Christie, which we have referenced time and time again on this podcast. And we had a transatlantic phone conversation with him discussing a lot of different things, but a lot of literary theory and queer theory, which is not something we get to discuss too often on this podcast. So I am excited to share that conversation with you.
I have to say this much. Dark Marple is definitely touched upon.
Absolutely. Catherine may have somehow gotten some support for her dark marple theory here in an unlikely corner. So we have that to look forward to. And then, of course, our next novel after that is Towards Zero. So stay tuned for that.
We're looking forward to that.
Yep. And in the meantime, we would love to hear from you. Email us at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha. We are on Twitter at All About the Dame. Catherine is at Brobcat. We are on Instagram at All About Agatha, and we really appreciate it when people take a moment to rate and review us wherever they're listening to this podcast, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.